Housing was a serious issue in 1930s Dublin, just as it is today. There's a misconception that after the British left, the tenements were done away with. However, they remained a part of Dublin life for decades after independence. In the 1930s, conditions were so unbearable in the tenements that tenants' leagues sprang up, fighting for the rights of tenants, and the Republican Congress were central to this campaigning. The issue of housing in 1930s Dublin had reached such a pressure point that even the mainstream press and media were demanding reform. The Irish Press newspaper launched its own housing campaign in the 1930s, reprinting images of working class families living in hellish accommodation. But the Irish Press blamed the slums on a British legacy and said that the Free State had inherited its slumdom from the British. Even the right wing complained about housing in Dublin in this period. The Irish Christian Front warned that the slums of Dublin were one of the greatest threats to Irish society, while a conservative letter writer in the Irish Press said there was little point in the government giving out about communism if they weren't going to tackle the evils that had given birth to that godless doctrine in other places. Among those who supported the Irish Press campaign was Maud Gon MacBride, who hoped that at least it would stop the cry of communist against those who campaigned for reform in housing in Dublin. Undoubtedly, however, the most harrowing reports came from the tenants' leagues themselves and were printed in the Republican Congress newspaper. At the heart of the Tenants' League campaign was the rent strike. Tenants refused to pay rack-renting landlords for the privilege of living in a hovel. Up to 30,000 people were still living in one-room tenements across the city. The housing conditions were simply unfit for human habitation. And no more were people going to pay for this while the buildings were crumbling around their ears. Some of the worst tenements in Dublin were here on Henrietta Street. We've come here today to meet local historian Terry Fagan and learn more about them.
Living in the tenement houses for the people, particularly in the 1920s and 1930s, it was horrific. There was only one toilet out there for a family, and there could be up to 100 people living in a tenement house. In some of the tenements, the handrails were long gone because people were in these places, and particularly in the winter time, they chopped up the tenements to keep heat into the room. Like the first thing to go in the tenement room, people told me, would have been the skirting boards. And then during the night you'd hear banging and you'd think there'd be a row upstairs, but it wouldn't be. It'd be someone just cutting down the banisters. Mainly the elderly were down in the basements and they were absolutely flooded over. So people used to have to come down and take the elderly woman up and bring her upstairs and take her out of the thing. So the lives were horrible in the tenements. And we were all on top of one another. People were living on top of one another. Like, I mean, as I said, some of these tenement houses, you had 10 families and up to 100 people was living in those. And they were all large families. Like, I mean, one bed, kids sleeping on the floor on what was called a polyas stuffed with straw. You know, 100 people in one house using one toilet out the backyard and one tap.
The Tenants' Leagues was largely run by Republican Congress personnel, and they involved themselves very heavily in that struggle. There was a protracted 2-month rent strike in the Westland Row area when many families withdrew their rent, and Garda intelligence closely monitored the Republican Congress during this time, perhaps fearful that other slum dwellers would follow suit. Ultimately, those living in the slums in the Westland Row area succeeded in winning a 25% rent reduction, an incredible achievement for the Republican Congress. Another of the major battles fought by the Tenants' Leagues was in relation to Magee Court, a series of run-down tenements in the south inner city, not far from Camden Street. They'd been described as filthy cottages that were only fit for the vermin that abounded within. On that occasion, Dublin Corporation bowed to the pressure of the Tenants' Leagues, rehousing the families of Magee Court. The Tenants' Leagues weren't only active in Dublin, in fact they were also active in Waterford, and it was in Waterford that things would turn personal. Frank Edwards, who lived here on Barrack Street, was one of the senior figures in the Republican Congress in Waterford, and he came from a staunchly Republican family. His mother had been involved in Republican prisoner support groups, while his elder brother Jack had been a Republican prisoner in Kilkenny prison during the Civil War. Jack died in mysterious circumstances in Kilkenny. It was alleged that when he was leaning out the window of his cell, talking to a man on the street below, a prison guard warned him to go back into his cell and he refused. He was then shot dead. Frank Edwards was one of the original members of Saor Éire, joining that organisation at the time of its incarnation in 1931. Now, we've already discussed the intense anti-communism in Irish society in the early 1930s, and Waterford was no exception to the rule. As well as being a political activist, Frank Edwards worked as a teacher here at Mount Zion CBS, and that meant ultimately he was accountable to the religious figures in the town, Monsignor Byrne and Bishop Kinane, both of whom were outspoken anti-communists. Bishop Kinane told one congregation that these enemies are active across the world in various forms, and by these enemies he meant communists. Edwards and the Tenants League in Waterford were very, very active in highlighting slum conditions here in the town. And as a frequent writer for the Republican Congress newspaper, that meant there was plenty of attention on Waterford slums. Edwards had a policy, unashamedly, of naming and shaming slum landlords, and this would bring him into direct confrontation with the church here.
He was secretary of the Trades Council, and they had a campaign on about the conditions of the tenements. They even brought a rat into, I think the rat was dead, into the council. And it was one of the landlords was the parish priest, which they didn't know originally was. And the Bishop of Waterford was very, very reactionary, Kinane. He would have been inclined, very much blue shirt inclined. And he was given the option, if he didn't go to the Republican Congress, he'd be allowed to resign. He'd probably be able to get another job. But this wasn't much of an offer. And and my mother were also there. My two parents were in the Republican Congress, both of them. So they did go, and there was a huge row in Waterford.
Monsignor Byrne was a trustee of several of the slums here in Waterford, so when Frank Edwards denounces the slum landlords, he brings himself into direct confrontation with the Catholic Church. Edwards would claim to be unaware of Monsignor Byrne's role in the slums at first. However, it is undeniable he was named on several occasions in the Republican Congress newspaper. In October 1934, Frank Edwards was served with his 3-month dismissal notice, and officially he was to lose his job because he attended the Republican Congress in Rathmines. He, however, subsequently claimed that the reason he was dismissed from his post was the fact he was exposing slum conditions here in Waterford. In January of 1935, a pastoral letter from the bishop was read out to congregations in Waterford. When it was read in the cathedral, many people left the church in disgust. Now, the principles and aims of the Republican Congress movement are opposed to the teachings of the Church. Its principles are socialist and communistic. It aims at setting up a socialist republic, evidently on the Russian model. And one of its weapons for achieving this is class hatred and class warfare. Evidently, one who belongs to a movement of this kind is unfit to be a teacher of Catholic children. The most appropriate course in the circumstances would have been instant dismissal. Meetings were organised in support of Frank Edwards here in Waterford, including one outside of this council chamber. Among the speakers who addressed demonstrations were Frank Ryan and Peadar O'Donnell, both of whom travelled from Dublin. Hundreds gathered on Broad Street in solidarity with Frank Edwards in the pouring rain, including former pupils who he had taught in the very school he had been dismissed from. However, public opinion was sharply divided here, and when Waterford Corporation issued a statement backing the church view, it was clear Edwards' position was untenable. He could not stay in such a divided Waterford. Instead, he took up a job in Dublin with the Republican Congress newspaper, a position he had been offered by Frank Ryan. Back in Dublin and the Congress were looking towards Armistice Day, or Remembrance Sunday, which was becoming a traditional day of violence in Dublin. Every 11th of November, the British Legion would march through the streets of Dublin, and as was fast becoming tradition, the IRA would attempt to stop them. There are often bloody scenes of confrontation on that day, and Congress were looking for a progressive way around it. The 11th of November, Armistice Day, had come to represent everything Republicans despised. They saw it very much as a celebration of British imperialism, and in the 20s and 30s, thousands of people, many of them ordinary working class Dubliners, gathered at the Phoenix Park and here at College Green in commemoration of their relatives who had died in the First World War. Now, Republicans were at pains to point out that they were not opposed to ordinary rank-and-file ex-servicemen, but rather British imperialism in the grand scale. Sadly, it was often rank-and-file ex-servicemen who ended up on the wrong side of beatings on the 11th of November. Crowds would gather on Armistice Day in College Green to observe 2 minutes of silence. However, that silence was always ended with Trinity College Dublin students leading the singing of God Save the King. This act no doubt infuriated Republicans in the capital. Surprisingly, in 1935, some of those who had previously organised counter-demonstrations on Armistice Day had a change of heart, and the Republican Congress organised an alternative Armistice Day here in the city, bringing wounded ex-servicemen from the Great War onto the streets of Dublin in a show of anti-imperialist defiance. Frank Ryan addressed the demonstration here on Abbey Street, and he told them that British Army officers were happy to observe 2 minutes of silence every year in honour of those who died in the war. But what about the other 364 days when ex-servicemen were rotting in Dublin slums?
Republican Congress argues that Republicans shouldn't object to the commemoration of the war dead, but they should object to their exploitation by imperialists and the glorification of war. So in November 1934, you have a number of ex-servicemen who are socialists or communists who come together with the Republican Congress and who hold alternative commemorations in Dublin, which hear denunciations of war, which mobilise around slogans such as freedom for this small nation, which, say that the First World War was an imperialist war, but that the men and women who fought and died should be remembered, who contrast the treatment of ex-servicemen with the leadership of the British Legion and their living conditions. And that really tries to provide an alternative focus. And Frank Ryan had been one of the leading figures in the IRA's disruption of Armistice Day. He'd been centrally involved in the street fighting. But in November 1934, he says that this is the proudest of all Armistice Days for me. And he actually says, I can understand why so many men who fought in that war would want to remember their fallen comrades. But what we want to do is remember them, but also argue then that we'll fight against future imperialist wars.
The Republican Congress contingent that day marched behind a very powerful banner which said, "Remember the dead, but fight for the living." They knew that many veterans of the First World War were living in poverty and penury, not only here in Ireland, but also right across the UK. The plan for this alternative Armistice Day was hatched by the 5 branches of the Republican Congress active here in the city of Dublin. But in the run-up to the big day, a 6th was established, comprised mainly of ex-servicemen and led by Captain Jack White, DSO, a founding member of the Irish Citizen Army in 1913.
Jack White was very centrally involved in the original formation of the Citizen Army in the period of the Dublin lockout. He went through a range of political metamorphosis since then. He became a member of the Irish Volunteers. Then by the 1930s he'd moved far to the left. He'd been writing letters to the IRA leadership criticising them for not being anti-clerical, arguing they should follow Tone and not Rome, believing that they'd let down the left by barring communists from membership. But he's not really involved with the Citizen Army or any other group at this stage. He's very much a figure who's on the fringes, who's relatively well known because of his past activity and is very vocal, but not a central part of this new movement.
Like other Republicans and Socialists, many members of this new Irish Citizen Army were destined to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Now, with the outbreak of the Civil War in Spain, it had an incredibly divisive effect on Irish society. And the church, the media and the political establishment all rallied behind General Franco against the Republicans. A most unusual stance to take given the course of history in this country. Much of the support for Franco was based on exaggerated claims of atrocities being carried out against the Catholic Church in Spain. A small band of Republicans and Socialists, however, were determined to fight on Spanish battlefields. They believed it was their duty to fight against fascism, and they were willing to risk everything.